August 2nd, 1942, south of Voronezh, Russia. Battery D7 faced encirclement as German armour advanced through morning haze. Sergeant Aleksei Morozov pressed against the breech of his 70mm M1 30 field gun, blood streaming from a shrapnel wound above his left eye. Through the cracked optical sight, the Panzer-30 wavered like a mirage. He fired. The shell landed 30 meters wide, kicking dust into the smoke-filled air. The recoil mechanism hissed, leaking hydraulic fluid onto scorched grass. Morozov tore off his helmet and surveyed the wreckage around him. 3 guns silenced, crews scattered, one barrel split open like a flower. He grabbed a bent nail from a splintered ammunition crate and jammed it into the sight mount, bending it slightly with his thumb. Through that improvised line, metal against metal, he sighted again. This time, the shell struck home. The Panzer halted, turret erupting in flame. By sundown, every surviving gun in the battery carried a similar modification. Soviet field reports would later refer to it simply as Morozov's correction. July 30th, 1942. The field battery arrived at its position near the Don River bend at dawn. Horse-drawn limbers struggling through mud still wet from recent rains. Lieutenant Viktor Reznov stood beside the command post, a shallow trench covered with canvas, and watched his gun crews unload the 6 76mm M1 30 field guns assigned to Battery D7. These weapons had been manufactured decades earlier, updated minimally in 1930, and now showed their age in every cracked breech ring and corroded recoil cylinder. Sergeant Aleksei Morozov walked the line, inspecting each gun with the methodical attention of a factory mechanic. He knelt beside the 3rd gun, running his fingers along a hairline fracture in the breech face. The metal felt warm despite the early hour. Behind him, Private Dmitry Kirov struggled with an ammunition crate, his hands already blistered from the morning's labour. Reznov approached, carrying a dispatch from divisional headquarters. The paper was creased and stained with someone else's sweat. He read aloud the essential facts. German armoured units were regrouping south of Voronezh. A thrust toward the Don crossings was expected within 72 hours. Battery D7 would hold this sector with available resources. Morozov straightened, wiping grease from his hands onto his trousers. He asked about replacement parts. Reznov shook his head. A Soviet ordnance report dated July 28, 1942, report number 442, had noted that 37% of field guns in the Voronezh sector were classified as unfit for sustained combat operations. Battery D7's guns fell within that category, though no one had officially declared them inoperable. They simply remained in service because alternatives did not exist. Morozov returned to his inspection, checking elevation mechanisms and sight mounts. The optical sights, German-made glass from before the revolution, salvaged and reused through 2 wars, were scratched and fogged. One lens showed a spiderweb crack across its center. He cleaned them as best he could with a rag that left more lint than clarity. Kirov watched, then asked quietly if the guns would fire when needed. Morozov considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. The breeches would hold, he said, for perhaps 200 rounds each. After that, metal fatigue would make predictions unreliable. The recoil systems were already leaking. Sustained fire would overheat the mechanisms. And the sights, he held up the cracked lens to the light. The sights assumed peacetime maintenance and factory-fresh optics. Theirs had neither. By midday, the gun crews had dug shallow firing pits and camouflaged the positions with cut grass and branches. The steppe stretched before them, flat and golden under summer heat. Reznov established a watch rotation and sent one man back to battalion headquarters for additional ammunition. The rest settled into the routines of waiting, cleaning weapons, writing letters, sleeping in whatever shade they could find. Morozov sat beside his gun, disassembling the sight mechanism for the third time. He knew these devices intimately, their German precision, their Soviet modifications, their accumulated flaws. Each gun's sight required individual calibration, compensating for manufacturing tolerances and years of use. The manual assumed clean optics, stable mounts, and trained crews. Battery D7 had none of these advantages. As evening approached, Reznov gathered the gun commanders for a brief meeting. He spread a map across an ammunition crate, weighting the corners with stones. The defensive sector stretched 4 kilometers, far too wide for 6 guns to cover effectively. German doctrine favored concentrated armor attacks. They would likely probe for weak points before committing their main force. Reznov's strategy was simple. Hold fire until targets entered effective range, then deliver maximum volume in minimum time. Speed and accuracy would matter more than prolonged engagement. Morozov asked about air support. Reznov admitted that none was promised. The Luftwaffe controlled daylight skies over most of the southern front. Soviet aircraft appeared sporadically, usually at dawn or dusk. The battery would fight alone, supported only by infantry units already stretched thin across the defensive line. That night, Morozov lay beside his gun, listening to distant artillery fire echo across the steppe. Somewhere to the south, other batteries were already engaged. He thought about the cracked sight glass, the failing recoil systems, the men who would die because equipment failed before courage did. The thought was not bitter, merely factual. In his notebook, a small leather-bound journal issued to NCOs for maintenance records, he wrote a single line: "If the tanks come tomorrow, they'll bury us with our guns." The morning of July 31st arrived with heat that shimmered across the steppe by 0800 hours. Battery D7 conducted firing drills using cardboard silhouettes placed at measured distances: 400 meters, 600 meters, 800 meters. The drill followed standard Soviet artillery procedure: target identification, range estimation, sight adjustment, fire command, and recoil management. Morozov's crew performed the sequence with mechanical efficiency, each man knowing his role without need for detailed orders. Kirov loaded shells with steady rhythm, despite hands that trembled slightly between rounds. The guns spoke with a flat crack that echoed across empty grassland, each shot followed by the hiss of the recoil mechanism returning the barrel to battery. Morozov watched through the optical sight, calling corrections after each round. The first shell landed short. He adjusted elevation, compensating for the sight's misalignment. The second shell struck closer, but still missed the cardboard silhouette by several meters. The third round hit, tearing the target apart in a spray of shredded cardboard. Reznov observed from the command post, noting accuracy rates in his log. Of 18 practice rounds fired that morning, 7 struck within acceptable margins. The others scattered across the impact zone, victims of worn rifling, inconsistent propellant charges, and optical imprecision. By peacetime standards, the performance would have warranted immediate weapons inspection and crew retraining. By summer 1942 standards, it was adequate. At midday, Reznov assembled the crews for a tactical briefing. He spoke plainly about their situation. German armor would arrive within 48 hours. Ammunition supply was limited to current stocks. Retreat was not authorized unless the position became untenable. He emphasized the importance of first-round accuracy. Each miss represented wasted resources and increased vulnerability. The men listened with the quiet attention of soldiers who understood that lectures meant death was approaching. After the briefing, Morozov gathered his crew around their gun. He explained the sight calibration process, showing them how to compensate for the cracked lens by adjusting their point of aim. The optical reticle was supposed to provide precise ranging marks, but the damaged glass distorted the image. Instead, Morozov had learned to aim by feel, using reference points on the sight housing itself. He demonstrated by sighting on a distant landmark, a lone tree perhaps 1,500 meters away. Through the cracked lens, the tree appeared as two overlapping images. Morozov ignored the optical picture entirely, instead aligning the target using the metal edges of the sight mount. It was crude, but functional, a method born from necessity rather than doctrine. Kirov asked if they would have time to aim carefully during actual combat. Morozov admitted that time would be scarce. German tanks moved quickly, and concentrated fire would force the crew to work faster than practice allowed. The question hung in the air between them, unanswered because no answer existed. That afternoon, the battery received a supply delivery, 40 additional rounds per gun, 3 replacement breech blocks, none of which fit the battery's weapons, and a case of gun oil. No optical components arrived. Morozov requested replacement sights through official channels, receiving in response a brief note, acknowledging the request and promising delivery when available. The Soviet supply system in summer 1942 operated under constant strain. Priority went to active combat units and newer weapons systems. Field guns from 1902 ranked low on the replacement list. As evening approached, Morozov cleaned the sights again, this time using a different technique. Instead of trying to restore optical clarity, an impossible task with damaged glass, he focused on stabilizing the sight mount itself. The housing had loosened from repeated recoil stress, introducing mechanical play that affected aiming precision. He tightened mounting bolts until the metal creaked, then tested the sight's movement. The adjustment improved stability, but could not repair the cracked lens. The gun was as ready as it would ever be. That night, distant fires glowed on the southern horizon. German reconnaissance aircraft had been spotted earlier in the day, high-altitude observers mapping Soviet positions. Reznov increased the watch rotation, placing 2 men on guard at all times. The crews slept beside their guns, ready for immediate action. Morozov lay awake, thinking about the mathematics of artillery fire, trajectory, velocity, time of flight, impact angle. The formulas assumed perfect conditions, stable platforms, precise sights, consistent ammunition. Reality offered none of these guarantees. He thought about the cracked lens, the way it split images into fragments, and wondered if there was a simpler method, something that didn't rely on glass precision. The thought remained incomplete, a problem without solution. Above him, stars wheeled slowly across a clear sky. Soviet artillery doctrine emphasized the importance of proper equipment maintenance and accurate ranging procedures. The manual, Instructions for Field Artillery, 1940 edition, contained detailed sections on sight calibration, optical care, and troubleshooting common malfunctions. It assumed, implicitly, that glass remained clean, mounts stayed rigid, and crews had access to replacement parts. Battery D7 had the manual. They lacked everything else. August 1st, 06:37 hours. Morning fog rolled across the steppe, reducing visibility to less than 200 meters. Morozov stood beside his gun, watching grey shapes move through the mist. The shapes resolved into German armoured reconnaissance vehicles. SDKFZ's 222 light armoured cars, moving in a loose line, probing the Soviet defensive positions. Reznov's order came through the field telephone. Hold fire until targets reached 400 meters. The battery waited, 6 guns silent in the fog. Morozov tracked the lead vehicle through his sight. The cracked lens and fog combined to create a blurred, ghostly image. He compensated by focusing on the darker mass of the vehicle rather than trying to use the optical reticle. At 380 meters, estimated by practiced eye rather than measured range, Reznov gave the fire command. Battery D7 fired together, 6 guns speaking within 2 seconds of each other. The sound rolled across the steppe like thunder. Morozov watched his shells impact through the sight, a fountain of earth erupting 15 meters short of the target. The fog swallowed the explosion instantly, leaving only a dark smudge where dirt hung in the air. Other shells landed scattered across the impact zone, none finding targets. The German vehicles halted, hesitated, then reversed rapidly back into the fog. The engagement lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Battery D7 had fired 6 rounds and achieved 0 hits. Reznov called for ceasefire. In the sudden silence, Morozov examined his sight. The fog had condensed on the lens surface, adding moisture to the existing cracks. The optical image was now completely unusable. He wiped the lens with his sleeve, which helped briefly before condensation reformed. Around him, other crews reported similar problems: fogged optics, missed shots, targets disappearing before corrections could be applied. One gun reported a cracked lens worse than Morozov's. Another had lost a reticle adjustment knob during recoil. The battery had survived first contact but had proven ineffective. Reznov arrived at Morozov's position minutes later, his face showing controlled frustration. He asked for Morozov's assessment. The sergeant responded with mechanical precision. The sights were inadequate for the conditions. Fog and lens damage combined to eliminate optical accuracy. Crews were compensating by aiming along the barrel itself, but this method provided minimal precision beyond 300 meters. Reznov asked if Morozov could improve the situation. Morozov considered the question carefully. The sights couldn't be repaired without replacement parts. The fog would burn off by mid-morning, but combat wouldn't wait for ideal weather. He could teach crews to aim by barrel alignment, but that technique required practice they didn't have time to develop. The honest answer was no, he couldn't improve the situation with available resources. But that answer meant accepting defeat before the real battle began. Instead, Morozov said he would try. By 0900 hours, the fog had dissipated, revealing the steppe under harsh morning sunlight. Morozov spent the next hour working on his sight, trying different approaches to the fundamental problem: how to aim accurately when optical precision was impossible. He cleaned the lens repeatedly, achieving momentary clarity that vanished as soon as he fired, and dust settled on the glass. He adjusted the sight mount, tightening bolts beyond normal specifications, but the cracked lens remained the limiting factor. Finally, he attempted to sight using only the metal frame of the sight housing, ignoring the optical components entirely. This method showed promise. The metal edges provided crude but stable reference lines, but it required perfect positioning and left no margin for ranging errors. At 11:30 hours, a Soviet radio message reported German armor concentrating south of the battery's position. Estimated strength, 1 company of medium tanks, supported by infantry. Expected contact time, early afternoon. Reznov relayed the information to his gun crews with characteristic directness. They would face approximately 12 to 15 tanks. Current ammunition stocks allowed roughly 60 rounds per gun. Doctrine called for 3 to 5 rounds per target to ensure destruction. The mathematics were simple and unfavorable. Morozov gathered his crew for final preparations. He explained his decision to abandon optical sighting in favor of barrel alignment, supplemented by sight frame references. Kirov asked if this method would work. Morozov admitted he didn't know. They would discover effectiveness during combat, when failure meant death. The crew received this information in silence. There was nothing more to say. By noon, heat shimmered across the steppe, creating mirages that made distance estimation nearly impossible. Morozov worked bare-chested under the sun, his skin already burned dark from weeks in the field. He rechecked the gun's mechanical systems, breech closure, recoil cylinder pressure, elevation gear function. Everything worked within acceptable tolerances, which meant everything was partially broken but still functional. A Soviet radio log from that afternoon, preserved in divisional archives, contains a brief entry under Battery D7's call sign. 0748. 2 misfires, no hits recorded. Await further contact. The entry was marked with a red pencil line. Someone at headquarters had noted the battery's poor performance. At 13:47 hours, distant engine sounds announced the German advance. Morozov settled behind his gun, checking sight alignment one final time. The cracked lens caught sunlight, throwing fractured rainbows across the breach. He thought about the morning's failed engagement and wondered if courage alone could compensate for inadequate equipment. The answer, he suspected, would arrive within minutes. Around him, the battery waited. 6 obsolete guns, 40 rounds each, optical sights that couldn't be trusted. And the tanks were coming. The afternoon of August 1st unfolded with brutal physics. Heat radiated from the gun barrels even before firing began, metal expanding in the relentless sun. Morozov wiped sweat from his eyes and watched the horizon waver in thermal distortion. German Panzer-Killing appeared as dark shapes in the shimmer, their exact positions uncertain until they closed to within 800 meters. Reznov issued the fire command at 14:10 hours. Morozov's first shot landed wide. The shell, visible for a fraction of a second before impact, sent dust skyward. He adjusted by instinct rather than calculation, shifting his aim 0.2 degrees left. The second round fell short. The Panzers continued advancing, their formation spreading to present multiple targets simultaneously. This was standard German armor doctrine: distribute fire, overwhelm defensive positions through maneuver rather than frontal assault. Battery D7 responded with volume, each gun firing as rapidly as crews could load and aim. The barrels heated further, thermal expansion affecting trajectory in ways that optical sights couldn't compensate for even when functional. Morozov's third shot struck glancing contact on a Panzer's frontal armor, the shell deflecting upward without penetrating. Kirov loaded another round, his movements now automatic despite trembling hands. The breech slammed shut. Morozov sighted again, this time aiming for center mass rather than attempting precision shots. The gun fired, recoiled, and hissed as hydraulic fluid leaked from the overworked cylinder. Through the dust and heat distortion, Morozov saw the shell impact harmlessly, 10 meters ahead of its intended target. By 14:30 hours, the German tanks had closed to 500 meters, and the engagement's geometry had shifted decisively against the battery. At this range, return fire became viable. One Panzer's 50mm gun spoke, sending a round shrieking overhead. The shell landed 40 meters behind Morozov's position, a reminder that their location was now registered. Reznov ordered concentration fire on the lead vehicles. 3 guns shifted aim, and for a moment, synchronized Soviet artillery worked as doctrine intended. 3 shells converged on a single Panzer within 2 seconds. One struck the track assembly, immobilizing the vehicle. The others missed, but forced the tank to halt and reverse. It was Battery D7's first successful hit of the engagement. The cost, 18 rounds expended. Then the mortar barrage arrived. German infantry mortars, positioned beyond direct observation, began dropping rounds across the battery's position. The first explosion landed between guns 3 and 4, sending shrapnel through the crews. Morozov dove beside his gun as fragments screamed overhead. Earth and smoke filled the air, reducing visibility to arm's length. Kirov pressed against the gun shield, his face pale with shock. When the barrage lifted after 90 seconds, 2 guns were silent, their crews scattered or wounded. The Panzers resumed their advance. Morozov returned to his position and found his optical sight coated with dust. He wiped it reflexively, then stopped. The motion was pointless. The lens had been useless before the barrage. Dust simply made the situation explicit. He sighted along the barrel itself, using the breech ring as a rear reference and the muzzle as a front point. This method, crude and imprecise, at least offered consistency. He fired. The shell landed, closer to target than any previous round that afternoon. The German advance halted at 14:48 hours, tanks pulling back to 700 meters. Reznov used the pause to assess damage. 2 guns out of action, 11 casualties among the crews, remaining ammunition stocks at approximately 30 rounds per functional gun. A Soviet supply memo dated July 27, 1942, documented the shortage of optical components across the Voronezh sector. The memo noted that replacement parts for older field guns ranked 4th priority behind tank optics, anti-aircraft sights, and small arms scopes. Battery D7's damaged sights would receive no replacements until higher priorities were satisfied. That evening, Morozov worked on his gun under failing light. The optical sight's mounting bracket had loosened during sustained fire, adding mechanical instability to optical failure. He tightened the bolts again, but the threads were stripped and wouldn't hold torque. The sight now shifted slightly with each shot, making any attempt at consistent aim impossible. He considered removing the sight entirely but hesitated. Even damaged optics provided some reference frame, some connection to proper artillery procedure. Removing the sight felt like admitting defeat. Kirov approached, carrying a canteen and what remained of their daily bread ration. They ate in silence, too exhausted for conversation. Other crews moved like ghosts through the darkening position, treating wounded, redistributing ammunition, preparing for another engagement they all knew was coming. Reznov visited each gun, offering brief words of encouragement that sounded hollow even as he spoke them. When he reached Morozov's position, he asked the question both men had been avoiding. Could the battery hold another day? Morozov looked at his gun. The cracked sight, the leaking recoil cylinder, the worn rifling that sent shells on increasingly unpredictable trajectories. He thought about the morning's fog, the afternoon's failures, the simple fact that they couldn't reliably hit targets their lives depended on destroying. Then he thought about the alternative: retreat, abandonment, watching German armor roll unopposed toward the Don crossings. He told Reznov they would hold. The lie felt necessary. That night, Morozov kept the broken sight beside him, wrapped in a rag that did nothing to protect already damaged glass. He kept it, he told himself, for alignment reference, not because it worked, but because it represented the idea that precision still mattered. Another part of him, the part that recognized futility when statistics proved it, knew the sight was useless. But he kept it anyway. Above, stars emerged in a clear sky. Somewhere to the south, German forces were regrouping, preparing for tomorrow's assault, and Battery D7's sights remained broken, its guns overheated, its men exhausted. The only certainty was that morning would bring more targets and more failure. Morozov closed his eyes and tried to sleep beside his gun. August the 2nd, 06:42 hours. The rumble reached them before visual contact, a low thunder that vibrated through the ground, unmistakable in its meaning. German armor was moving in strength. Morozov stood at his gun, watching the horizon lighten from grey to pale gold as sunrise approached. Reznov's voice came through the field telephone. steady despite circumstances. Prepare for contact, cover the retreating infantry. South of the battery's position, Soviet rifle units were pulling back from forward positions, having held through the night against German probing attacks. Their withdrawal was organized, but exhausted, companies reduced to platoon strength, weapons functioning on momentum and determination rather than tactical cohesion. Battery D7's mission was simple and probably suicidal: provide covering fire while infantry passed through the defensive line, then hold against whatever followed. At 06:58 hours, the Panzers appeared. 6 tanks in the first wave, advancing in a staggered line that presented no concentration of targets. Morozov counted them automatically: 3 Panzer IIIs, 2 Panzer IVs, identifiable by their shorter, wider turrets, and 1 command variant with additional radio antennas. The formation moved with practiced coordination, each tank covering sectors that overlapped neighboring units' blind spots. This was veteran armor, not the hasty assaults of earlier in the campaign. Reznov ordered ranging shots. The battery fired together and Morozov watched his shell kick dirt 50 meters ahead of the nearest panzer. The optical sight provided no useful information, just a blur of cracked glass and dust. He had already decided to abandon it entirely, but hadn't yet determined what would replace it. For now, he aimed by barrel alignment, checking the angle by eye and hoping muscle memory compensated for missing precision. The gun fired again, another miss, this time falling short. Kirov loaded the next round with mechanical efficiency. The motions so practiced, they required no conscious thought. His hands still trembled, but the tremor was steady now, incorporated into the rhythm of combat. The breech closed with a heavy clang. Morozov sighted along the barrel for the 3rd attempt. The Panzer was now at 600 meters, close enough that he could see details: the commander's hatch, the gun mantlet, the splash of mud on the lower hull. He aimed for center mass, knowing the 76 mm shell would penetrate frontal armor only at perfect angles. The gun fired, and the recoil threw him back a step. Through the smoke, he saw the shell strike low, hitting the earth just in front of the tank's glacis plate. The Panzer kept advancing. At 07:02 hours, the situation evolved from difficult to critical. The German tanks had closed to 400 meters and were now returning fire. A 75 mm shell from a Panzer rifle struck the ground between Morozov's gun and the next position, the explosion sending shrapnel through the crew area. Kirov was hit in the shoulder, the impact spinning him against the gun shield. He slid to the ground, conscious but bleeding. Morozov pulled him into the shallow trench behind the gun, then returned to his position. There was no time for medical attention. The tanks were still coming. He loaded the next round himself, struggling with the shell's weight and the mechanical complexity of breech operation. The brass casing stuck briefly before seating properly. He slammed the breech closed and sighted again, his heart hammering in his chest with adrenaline and exertion. The gun shook violently when it fired, the worn recoil system barely containing the forces involved. The optical sight mount, already loose, vibrated completely free from its housing and fell to the ground. Morozov stared at it for a moment. The cracked lens, the bent frame, the complete failure of manufactured precision. Then he looked back at his gun. Without the sight, he had only the barrel itself and whatever improvised method he could devise in the next few seconds. The Panzer at 400 meters was aiming at his position. He could see the turret rotating, the gun barrel elevating slightly. Perhaps 20 seconds until it fired. Morozov searched desperately for any solution. His eye fell on a broken ammunition crate beside the gun pit, its wooden sides splintered from yesterday's mortar barrage. A bent nail protruded from one board, perhaps 8 centimeters long, rusted and crooked. He grabbed it, yanking it free from the wood. The nail was rough in his hand, warm from the sun, utterly inadequate for precision engineering. He looked at the sight mount, now empty after the optics fell away, and then at the nail. An idea formed, born not from doctrine or training, but from pure necessity. He jammed the nail into the empty sight mount, forcing it between metal flanges until it held firm. Then, using his thumb, he bent the nail slightly, creating an angle that approximated his line of sight from previous shots. The nail's tip now pointed slightly left and low compared to the barrel's bore axis. It was crude. It was desperate. It was something. Kirov, still conscious and watching from the trench, said quietly, "You'll blind us both." Morozov positioned himself behind the gun, looking past the nail's tip toward the approaching Panzer. The improvised sight created a rough alignment, not precise, but consistent. He could reference the nail against the target, compensating for distance by elevation and windage by instinct. It was less accurate than proper optics, but more reliable than pure guesswork. He loaded another round, seated it firmly, and closed the breech. Through his improvised sight, a bent nail in an empty mount, he aimed at the Panzer, now 350 meters distant. The gun fired. The shells struck the Panzer's right side armor at a steep angle, penetrating and detonating inside the hull. The tank lurched to a halt, smoke pouring from vision ports. Within seconds, flames erupted from the engine compartment. The crew bailed out, running from the burning vehicle. Morozov stared at his gun, then at the nail, then back at the burning Panzer. One nail, one tank. The mathematics had somehow worked. Around him, other crews were still firing with conventional methods and conventional results. Shells landing scattered across the impact zone. Minimal hits, maximum ammunition expenditure. His gun had just achieved what proper optics couldn't deliver, a clean kill at combat range. Kirov, despite his wound, began laughing, a sound somewhere between hysteria and genuine joy. "Better blind than buried," Morozov said quietly. By 1800 hours on August 2nd, 5 guns in Battery D7 had adopted variations of Morozov's nail sight. Word had spread through the crews with the speed that only survival techniques achieve in combat. Each gunner found their own nail, wire, or metal fragment, bending it to approximate their individual sight picture. Some used chalk to mark reference lines on the gun shield. Others simply drove the nail directly into the existing sight mount, as Morozov had done. The battery's performance improved immediately. Not to peacetime standards, never that, but to a level where ammunition expenditure translated into observable results. During an engagement at 16:45 hours, the battery fired 23 rounds and achieved 4 hits, a ratio that would have been unthinkable hours earlier. 2 German tanks withdrew with damage. 1 burned completely. The rest pulled back to reassess their approach. Reznov watched this development with careful attention. He was a young officer, promoted in the field after his predecessor's death during the May offensive. His training emphasized doctrine, procedure, and proper equipment utilization. The nail sight violated every principle of precision artillery. It was improvised, unstandardized, and completely undocumented in any manual. It also worked. That evening, Reznov sat in the command post, still just a shallow trench with canvas overhead, and drafted a report. His handwriting was precise despite exhaustion. Combat effectiveness of Battery D7 improved following field modification of direct-fire sighting systems. Sergeant A. Morozov developed improvised direct sight alignment using available materials. Method allows gunners to compensate for damaged optical components through fixed reference points. Effective range approximately 600 meters against medium armor. Request technical evaluation of procedure for possible wider implementation. He read the report twice, struck out several phrases that seemed too enthusiastic, then reread the result. The words felt inadequate to describe what he had witnessed: desperate men making obsolete weapons, functional through pure necessity. But military reports required objectivity, not poetry. He marked the message priority routine and sent it up the chain of command. A Soviet artillery memo dated August 3, 1942, filed in the archives of the 21st Army's headquarters, contains a brief marginal note beside a section on equipment shortages. 21st Army reports improvised direct sight alignment observed in field batteries. Method under evaluation. The note was circled in red pencil, suggesting someone higher in the command structure had taken interest. At Morozov's gun position, the crew worked through early evening to refine the nail sight. The initial installation had been crude, a bent nail jammed into the mount without consideration for long-term durability. Now, with time to improve the design, Morozov wire-wrapped the nail to provide better stability. He bent it more carefully, creating a consistent angle that corresponded to his natural aiming posture. The result was still improvised but increasingly functional. Kirov, his shoulder bandaged and his arm in a makeshift sling, watched the process with the focused attention of someone whose life depended on understanding technique. He asked how Morozov knew where to bend the nail. The sergeant explained that it was partly mathematics, compensating for the barrel's bore axis relative to the sight mount, and partly experience. Each gun had slight variations in how it fired. The nail sight needed to account for these individual characteristics. It was custom work, the opposite of mass production, and it demanded that gunners know their weapons intimately. Other crews arrived throughout the evening to observe Morozov's refined installation. He explained the process patiently. Find a rigid reference point in the sight mount. Select a nail or wire that won't bend easily under recoil vibration. Position it to create a front sight that aligns with your eye when standing in firing position. Bend it to compensate for your gun's particular trajectory. Each gunner needed to develop their own sight through trial and error. There was no standard template because every gun and every gunner was different. By nightfall, the battery resembled a makeshift workshop. Crews clustered around their guns, bending nails, marking reference lines, testing sight pictures against distant landmarks. The work had a quality of concentration that combat rarely allowed. Focused problem-solving rather than desperate reaction. Reznov moved among the positions, observing but not interfering. He recognized that Morozov's practical knowledge exceeded his own theoretical training. This was field innovation at its most basic level, soldiers adapting to circumstances that doctrine hadn't anticipated. At 21:30 hours, Reznov received a response to his earlier report. The message was brief. Report received. Continue current methods. Detailed technical description requested for artillery staff evaluation. The message was signed by the 21st Army's Chief of Artillery, a colonel whose name Reznov recognized from pre-war publications on modern gunnery techniques. Someone in Moscow was paying attention. That night, Morozov sat beside his gun, looking at the nail sight by moonlight. The bent metal caught silver light, throwing tiny shadows across the breach. It was such a simple thing, a piece of hardware store material pressed into service because precision manufacturing had failed, yet it represented something larger. The ability of soldiers to continue fighting when systems broke down, when supply chains couldn't deliver, when doctrine met reality and came up short. He thought about the morning's desperation, the moment when the optical sight fell away and left him with nothing but a gun and incoming fire. The nail had been an act of desperation, not innovation. Only afterward had it become a technique worth documenting. He wondered how many other soldiers, in how many other desperate moments, had created similar solutions that died with them because no one survived to report the method. The thought was sobering. Around him, the battery settled into night routines. Sentries watched the dark steppe. Wounded men received what medical attention was available. Ammunition was counted, redistributed, and counted again. The guns stood silent, their barrels cooling in night air, their crews sleeping in nearby trenches, and each gun now carried a bent nail where precision optics should have been. In the historical record, August 2nd, 1942, marks an unremarkable day in the Voronezh sector. German forces advanced. Soviet forces resisted. Casualties accumulated on both sides. Battalion reports noted nothing exceptional about Battery D7's performance. Yet in that single battery, on that single day, necessity had created a method that would spread through the Red Army's field artillery units within weeks. The nail sight was never officially standardized. It appeared in field manuals only as a footnote, a technique for emergency situations when proper equipment was unavailable. But among gunners who fought with obsolete weapons and damaged optics, it became common knowledge, a skill passed from crew to crew through demonstration rather than written instruction. Tomorrow would bring more combat, more tanks, more opportunities to test whether bent metal could substitute for German precision optics. For now, the battery slept, and the nail sights waited. August 2nd, 22:30 hours. While Battery D7 rested, Reznov worked by candlelight on his detailed technical report. The message to headquarters had been brief by necessity. Now he drafted the comprehensive documentation that artillery staff would need to evaluate Morozov's method. He began with measurable results. Combat engagement 16:45, 17:03 hours, 2nd August 1942. 6 guns employing improvised direct sight method. 23 rounds expended, 4 confirmed hits at ranges 400-650 meters, 2 enemy vehicles immobilized, 1 destroyed. Compared to morning engagement, same date, 18 rounds, 1 hit, damaged optics throughout battery. The numbers told the story more effectively than narrative could. He continued with technical description, though his engineering vocabulary felt inadequate. Method utilizes rigid metal rod, nail, wire or similar material inserted into damaged optical sight mount. Rod is bent to align with gunner's natural sight picture when in firing position, acts as crude front sight with breech ring or other gun feature serving as rear reference. Alignment is individual to each gun and gunner. No standardization possible. He paused, considering how to explain that the method's strength lay precisely in its lack of standardization. Each crew adapted the basic concept to their specific circumstances, their guns' particular wear patterns, their ammunition's characteristics, their own physical positioning. It was artillery practice reduced to its most fundamental level, pointing metal at a target and adjusting until the geometry worked. By midnight, Reznov had filled 3 pages with his precise handwriting. He folded the report, placed it in an envelope marked for the divisional artillery commander, and gave it to the night courier. The document would reach headquarters by dawn, be forwarded to army level by noon, and possibly arrive in Moscow within a week. Whether it would influence anything beyond Battery D7's sector was impossible to predict. Across the defensive line, other batteries were discovering similar solutions to similar problems. A gun crew 50 kilometers east had improvised a sight using a machine gun's front post, torn from a destroyed weapon and wire tied to their field gun. Another battery had chalked aiming marks directly onto their gun shields, creating a crude but functional reference grid. None of these crews knew about each other's innovations. They simply adapted, survived, and occasionally reported their methods through official channels that moved information at the speed of paper and exhausted couriers. The nail sight was spreading through parallel invention, multiple soldiers reaching the same conclusion under identical pressures. August 3rd began with pre-dawn darkness and the sound of German artillery preparation. Shells fell across the Soviet defensive line with methodical precision, targeting known gun positions and communication trenches. Battery D7 huddled in their shallow pits while the barrage walked back and forth across their sector. Morozov pressed against the earth, feeling each explosion through the ground itself. At 07:17 hours, the barrage lifted. In the sudden silence, Reznov's voice came through the field telephone. "Prepare for assault. Count 6+ vehicles approaching from south." Morozov climbed to his gun position and checked the nail sight. The overnight wire wrapping had held. The nail remained stable in its mount. He looked across the steppe, now hazed with dust from the bombardment, and counted dark shapes moving through the smoke. 6 became 7, then 8, as more tanks emerged from defilade positions. This was a serious assault, not the probing attacks of previous days. Beside him, Kirov took his position despite the Kai shoulder wound. The loader's hands no longer trembled. Adrenaline and necessity had burned away that particular weakness. He loaded a round, and the breech closed, with its familiar metallic clang. The first Panzer entered effective range at 07:28 hours. Morozov sighted through his nail, aligning the bent tip with the tank's center mass. The geometry felt right, a sense of correctness that came from hours of practice, not from any optical measurement. He fired. The shell struck the Panzer's turret at a shallow angle, deflecting off the armor without penetrating. The tank kept advancing. Morozov adjusted, aiming lower for the hull rather than the better protected turret. Second round, hit, but again, no penetration. The 76mm gun was adequate against medium armor at optimal angles, but German tank design had evolved to deflect shots that didn't strike perfectly perpendicular to the armor face. Morozov needed better geometry or better luck. Third round, the shell caught the Panzer's track assembly, shearing metal and immobilizing the vehicle. Not a kill, but good enough. The tank slewed to a halt, crew already bailing out before the follow-up shot could finish the job. Around him, the battery was firing with unprecedented coordination. 5 guns, each using nail sights, each gunner working with newly confident precision. The engagement had the character of a training exercise, deliberate, measured, effective. Except the targets fired back, and shells were landing among the gun positions with increasing accuracy. At 07:42 hours, a German round struck Gun 3 directly, detonating the ready ammunition and killing the entire crew. The explosion sent debris across adjacent positions. Morozov felt the blast wave, heard shrapnel whine overhead, and kept firing. There was nothing else to do. The battle developed into a close-range slugging match. German armor trading fire with Soviet field guns at distances where both sides' weapons were lethal. This was the warfare of 1942's Eastern Front, brutal, direct, and decided by whoever made fewer mistakes under extreme pressure. Morozov's gun achieved 2 more hits over the next 15 minutes, both solid strikes that penetrated armor and sent flames through interior spaces. By 08:03 hours, the German assault had stalled. 4 Panzers burned across the approach zone, the others had pulled back beyond direct fire range. Battery D7 had held, but at severe cost. 2 guns destroyed, 14 casualties, remaining ammunition down to 20 rounds per surviving gun. A German division report, later captured and translated, noted for August 3rd. Unexpected artillery accuracy encountered south of Voronezh. Losses: 3 Panzer-3 destroyed, 2 Panzer-4 damaged. Infantry support withdrawn. pending artillery suppression. The note was marked für Beachtung, for attention, suggesting someone in the German command structure had noticed that Soviet field guns were suddenly more effective than previous engagements would predict. Reznov called for status reports. The responses came back in clipped, exhausted voices. Gun 1, operational. Gun 2, destroyed. Gun 3, destroyed. Gun 4, operational, but crew reduced to 2 men. Gun 5, operational. Gun 6, damaged, but fireable. 4 functional guns remained, each using nail sights. Each crew now veteran in the method's practical application. At 14:20 hours, Reznov sent another message to headquarters. Battery D7 continues to hold. Morozov, correction site, proving effective under sustained combat. Request dissemination of technique to other field batteries. That evening, as the sector fell quiet except for sporadic small arms fire, Morozov inspected his gun one final time. The barrel was overheated, the rifling worn smooth in places, the recoil cylinder empty of hydraulic fluid. The nail sight remained stable, its bent tip still aligned to the bore axis through angles that mathematics could describe, but that Morozov had discovered through pure trial. He thought about the tanks burning in the approach zone, the crews who hadn't survived this day, the simple fact that a bent nail had somehow made the difference between defeat and survival. Tomorrow would bring more fighting, but tonight the battery had held. August 3rd, 07:42 hours, 20 German tanks advanced in 2 waves, their formation suggesting careful planning rather than hasty assault. Morozov watched them through his nail sight, counting silhouettes as they emerged from morning haze. The geometry was clear. German command had decided that Battery D7's position needed to be eliminated, and they were committing sufficient force to ensure success. Reznov's voice came through the field telephone, steady despite circumstances. All guns, prepare for mass engagement, fire on command. The 4 surviving guns of Battery D7 waited. Each crew understood that this engagement would likely be their last. Either they broke the German assault, or the battery ceased to exist. There was clarity in that knowledge, a simplification of all tactical complexity into basic mathematics. Hit more targets than they hit you. At 07:46 hours, the first wave reached optimal range. Reznov gave the fire command. Morozov's round struck a Panzer III on its glacis plate, penetrating and detonating inside the hull. The tank's turret lifted slightly from the explosion's overpressure before settling back askew. 1 down, 19 remaining. Kirov loaded the next round with mechanical efficiency. His wounded shoulder had stiffened overnight, limiting movement, but muscle memory compensated. The breach closed. Morozov sighted through his nail and fired again. This shot struck track guards, tearing metal but not stopping the vehicle. The Panzer kept advancing, its gun traversing toward Morozov's position. Around him, the other guns were firing in rapid sequence. The noise was overwhelming, each shot a physical impact that compressed air and shook the ground. Smoke and dust reduced visibility to fragmented snapshots. A tank here, an explosion there, tracers cutting red lines through the haze. Morozov adjusted his aim by fractions, compensating for recoil drift and barrel heat. The nail sight, despite its crudeness, provided consistent reference. He could see the target align the nail's tip and trust that the geometry would hold. It was remarkably similar to rifle shooting, the same basic principles of sight alignment and trigger control, just scaled up to 76 mm shells and armored targets. Third round, miss. The shell landed 5 meters ahead of the advancing Panzer, throwing dirt across the hull. Fourth round, hit. The tank lurched, smoke pouring from its engine compartment. Not a kill, but enough to force the crew to abandon their vehicle. By 0812 hours, the character of the engagement had shifted from exchange of fire to pure survival. German tanks had closed to 300 meters, close enough that their guns could penetrate Battery D7's thin gun shields. A 75mm round struck Gun 4's position, killing the loader and wounding the gunner. The gun fell silent. 3 guns remained operational. Morozov fired until his hands blistered, loading when Kirov couldn't, aiming through vision blurred with sweat and smoke. The nail sight held its alignment, despite the gun's violent recoil. Each shot felt like the last. Each shell could be the one that struck home, or the one that drew fatal return fire. At 0831 hours, shells began landing among the gun positions from indirect fire. German artillery had registered the battery's location and was now delivering suppression fires. The explosions walked across the defensive line with methodical precision. Gun 5 took a direct hit, the shell detonating against the breech and sending fragments through the crew. Morozov heard screaming, abruptly cut off. 2 guns remained. His and Gun 1, commanded by a corporal named Dmitriev. The tactical situation had degraded beyond anything Doctrine could address. 2 guns against perhaps 15 remaining tanks, German artillery now active, and ammunition stocks nearly exhausted. Reznov's voice came through the field telephone one last time. "All guns, withdraw authorization granted. Fall back to secondary positions." Morozov heard the order. He looked at his gun, the worn barrel, the bent nail sight, the pile of spent casings around the position. Then he looked at the advancing tanks, still 400 meters distant, but closing steadily. He made a decision that wasn't his to make. He stayed. Kirov stared at him, understanding and horror mixing in equal measure. Morozov said simply, "Load." They fired alone for the next 17 minutes. A historical note from a German after-action report dated August 4, 1942, describes the final phase. Single Soviet field gun continued firing despite overwhelming tactical disadvantage, guns silenced by direct fire at approximately 0853 hours. Crew casualties presumed total, but those 17 minutes produced 5 more hits. Morozov had abandoned tactical thinking entirely, operating on pure technical procedure. Sight, fire, reload, sight again. The nail gave him a reference point in chaos. The gun gave him a way to strike back, and Kirov gave him ammunition until the loader collapsed from exhaustion and blood loss. Then Morozov loaded himself, working the breech one-handed while the other hand maintained aim. The barrel glowed red from sustained fire. The recoil mechanism had failed completely. Each shot sent the gun backward 2 meters, and Morozov had to re-aim from scratch. The nail sight bent slightly from the recoil stress, but remained functional enough. At 0851 hours, a Panzer-4's 75mm gun fired from 200 meters. The shell struck Morozov's gun shield, penetrating and detonating inside the position. When the smoke cleared, the gun was silent. Battery D7 had ceased to exist as a fighting unit. The field fell quiet, except for burning vehicles and the occasional crack of small arms fire. German infantry moved through the position at 0947 hours, finding what remained of Battery D7, shattered guns, scattered ammunition, and bodies that had defended metal until metal and flesh both failed. A Soviet casualty report filed 3 days later listed Sergeant Aleksei Morozov among 14 killed in action on August 3, 1942. The report noted his unit, rank, and date of death. It did not mention the nail sight. A German intelligence officer inspected the captured gun positions that afternoon, photographing the improvised sighting devices found on 3 of the destroyed weapons. His report, forwarded to the Oberkommando des Heeres, described the nail sights as, quote, primitive but potentially effective direct fire alignments. The report recommended attention to Soviet field improvisation, noting that equipment shortages were producing unexpected tactical adaptations. One photograph from that inspection survives in German military archives. A bent nail, still wire-wrapped to a sight mount, the metal blackened by fire, but the improvisation clearly visible. The photograph is captioned, Russische Feldmodifikation, August 1942, Russian Field Modification, August 1942. Lieutenant Viktor Reznov survived the battle, though his battery did not. He retreated to secondary positions with 7 men, all that remained from the original 43 personnel assigned to Battery D7. His final report, written in a hospital while recovering from shrapnel wounds, documented Morozov's last stand. Sergeant Morozov continued firing despite withdrawal authorization. His accurate fire from improvised sight system disrupted enemy advance and allowed partial evacuation of adjacent infantry positions. Recommend posthumous recognition. The recommendation was noted and filed. No medal was awarded. August 1942 produced too many cases of exceptional courage for the administrative system to process them all. But Reznov's technical descriptions of the nails site continued forward through the chain of command. By mid-August, copies of his reports had reached the Soviet Artillery Directorate in Moscow. Field burial records indicate that Morozov was interred near his gun position in a mass grave with other battery casualties. The grave's location was lost during later fighting in the sector. No marker was ever placed. In 1943, after Soviet forces retook the Voronezh region, a recovery team surveyed battlefield sites for salvageable equipment. They found the remains of Battery D7's positions, rusted gun barrels, shattered wheels, spent shell casings by the thousands. One gun's sight mount still carried a bent nail, now rusted orange, but still clearly a deliberate modification. The recovery team included the nail in their report, noting it as an example of field improvisation from the defensive battles of 1942. The artifact was not preserved. It went to a scrap metal collection point, along with other battlefield debris. But the photograph taken by the German officer and the descriptions in Soviet reports ensured that the nail site's design survived, even when the physical examples did not. Morozov died citing his gun. That detail appears in 3 separate documents: Reznov's report, a battalion casualty log, and a brief memoir written decades later by a surviving infantry officer who witnessed the battle from an adjacent position. The officer wrote, "We could see one gun still firing long after the others fell silent. The sergeant aimed carefully, mechanically, as though conducting a peacetime exercise. When the end came, he was looking through his sight." The nail had given him that, a way to die, doing what he knew how to do, using a tool he understood, fighting with precision, even when everything else had failed. It was a small gift, but on August 3rd, 1942, it was enough. September 1942, Lieutenant Reznov's detailed technical report reached the desk of Colonel Mikhail Chistyakov, Chief of Artillery for the 21st Army. Chistyakov read the document twice, then summoned his technical staff. The meeting lasted 3 hours, examining the practical implications of field improvised sighting systems. The conclusion was pragmatic. If optical sights were unavailable or damaged, a common situation across the Voronezh sector, then improvised alignments using simple metal references represented a viable alternative. Not optimal, but viable, better than blind fire or abandoning positions entirely. Chistyakov drafted a memo to the Artillery Directorate in Moscow. Field reports indicate effective improvised direct aim correction sight developed by forward battery under combat conditions. Method requires minimal materials, provides adequate accuracy at ranges up to 600 meters. Recommend evaluation for inclusion in field manuals as emergency procedure. The memo was filed, reviewed, and eventually incorporated into Soviet artillery doctrine with characteristic bureaucratic caution. A training supplement issued in October 1942, Emergency Field Procedures for Artillery Units, Supplement 742, included a brief section on improvised sighting. When optical components are damaged or unavailable, field personnel may construct emergency reference alignments using available rigid materials, wire, nails, metal fragments, mount material to provide front sight reference, adjust to align with bore axis through test firing. Method is not substitute for proper optical sights, but may provide acceptable accuracy under emergency conditions. The text was dry, technical, stripped of any human context. It did not mention Morozov, Battery D7, or the desperate circumstances that had forced the innovation. Military doctrine rarely credits individual soldiers. It simply absorbs their lessons and moves forward. By December 1942, nails sights had appeared in field batteries across the southern front. Crews fashioned them from whatever materials were available: nails from ammunition crates, wire from field telephone spools, metal fragments from destroyed equipment. Each installation was unique, custom fitted to individual guns and gunners. The method spread through demonstration rather than written instruction, passed from veteran crews to replacement personnel with the same organic transmission that characterized most fieldcraft. A Soviet artillery study conducted in 1943, reviewing the defensive battles of 1942, included a technical analysis of improvised sighting methods. The study noted, emergency sight alignments provided by field personnel demonstrated effectiveness ratios comparable to damaged optical systems, with significantly improved crew confidence. Method particularly valuable in units equipped with obsolete weapons lacking modern optical components. Recommend continued authorization for field improvisation when standard equipment unavailable. The study was classified and distributed only to artillery commanders at Army level and above. Its findings influenced training doctrine but received no public recognition. In 1946, after the war's conclusion, the Soviet Artillery Journal published a retrospective article on technical innovations of the war years. Among discussions of new gun designs and improved ammunition types, one paragraph addressed field improvisation. Personnel at all levels demonstrated exceptional adaptability when standard equipment proved inadequate. Simple modifications, including improvised sighting alignments, extended the service life of obsolete weapons and maintained defensive capabilities under severe material shortages. Innovation begins where manuals end. The article did not name Morozov. By 1946, his name existed only in casualty records and in Viktor Reznov's fading memory. Reznov survived the war, was promoted to major, and served in artillery commands through 1947 before returning to civilian life. He never forgot August 3, 1942, or the man who had taught him that desperation could produce solutions that doctrine never anticipated. In a letter written to a fellow veteran in 1952, Reznov described the battle briefly. We held because one sergeant refused to accept that broken equipment meant broken men. He found a nail and bent it until it worked. That was the war in small, making do, adapting, surviving. The Central Museum of the Armed Forces acquired a collection of weapons from storage depots being cleared for new construction. Among the field guns delivered was a M11902 30-76 cm weapon, its serial number indicating manufacture in 1916 and refurbishment in 1931. The gun's condition reflected hard use, worn rifling, cracked breech, and extensive field repairs. A curator named Anatoly Volkov inspected the weapon during cataloguing. He noted the standard features, photographed the identification markings, and began preparing the description card for museum records. Then he noticed the sight mount. Instead of optical components, the mount held a piece of bent wire, carefully wrapped and positioned to provide a crude front sight. The installation showed clear signs of deliberate engineering. This was not casual damage, but intentional modification. Volkov examined the wire more closely, then checked the gun's provenance documentation. The weapon had been recovered from the Voronezh sector in 1943, stored in a depot near Kursk, and had remained there until this recent transfer. He photographed the improvised sight from multiple angles and drafted a query to the military history department. Could they provide context for this field modification? The response arrived 3 weeks later, a brief note referencing Artillery Supplement 742 and describing emergency sighting procedures developed during defensive battles of 1942. The note mentioned that such modifications had been relatively common in field batteries operating with damaged or obsolete equipment. No specific attribution was provided. Volkov prepared the museum display card. 70-60mm field gun, M1-02-30, modified with improvised sight, Voronezh sector, 1942, example of field adaptation under combat conditions. The gun was placed in a gallery dedicated to artillery development, positioned among more modern weapons to illustrate the progression of Soviet gunnery. The bent wire sight, blackened and corroded, but still clearly visible, became a footnote to larger stories of industrial production and technical advancement. Visitors walked past it daily, most without noticing the small bent wire that represented the difference between survival and defeat for men whose names were lost to history. In 1961, a technical institute in Leningrad conducted a study on artillery accuracy under field conditions. The study included historical analysis of World War II gunnery performance, examining factors that affected hit rates in combat. One section addressed improvised sighting systems. Field modifications to sighting equipment, while technically inferior to manufactured optical systems, provided psychological as well as practical benefits. Crews operating with improvised sights reported higher confidence than those attempting to use damaged optical equipment. The ability to adapt equipment fostered sense of control over tactical situation, improving overall combat effectiveness beyond purely technical considerations. The study concluded that future artillery training should include instruction on emergency improvisation, not as preferred method, but as essential skill for maintaining capability when standard equipment failed. The recommendations were incorporated into Soviet artillery training manuals through the 1960s. By then, optical technology had advanced substantially. Modern sights were more durable, more accurate, and more readily available than the German-made glass of 1942. But the principle remained: soldiers must know how to adapt when systems fail. 1973. A Soviet military historian named Georgy Kuznetsov researched a book on artillery operations during the Battle of Voronezh. He reviewed thousands of documents, unit reports, casualty lists, after-action summaries, personal diaries. In the archives of the 21st Army, he found Lieutenant Reznov's technical reports from August 1942, including the detailed description of Morozov's nail sight. Kuznetsov included a brief mention in his book. Sergeant A. Morozov, Battery D7, developed an improvised direct fire sight using available materials. The method spread through adjacent units and later received official recognition in field manuals. Morozov was killed in action August 3, 1942, during the defensive battles south of Voronezh. The book was published in 1975 with a print run of 3,000 copies, distributed primarily to military libraries and history departments. Most readers skipped past the brief mention of Morozov's innovation, focusing instead on strategic analyses and command decisions, but the name was preserved, connected to the technique, documented for anyone who cared to look. 2018. A researcher at the Russian State Military Archive digitized documents from the 1942 Voronezh campaign. Among the scanned files was Reznov's August 1942 report, complete with hand-drawn diagrams of the nail site installation. The document was uploaded to the archive's online database, tagged with keywords: artillery, improvisation, 1942, Voronezh, Morozov. It joined millions of other documents, most unread, all waiting for someone to need them. The bent wire from the museum's M1902-30 gun still sits in its mount, though the gun itself was moved to storage in 2003 to make room for more comprehensive exhibits. The improvised sight remains attached, a small piece of rust-orange metal that once meant the difference between life and death. No placard explains its significance. The museum's database entry notes only: field modification, purpose, emergency sighting alignment. In the end, Morozov's legacy is not fame, but function. The nail sight worked. It spread through the Red Army, not because it was elegant or sophisticated, but because it solved a real problem for men who needed solutions more than they needed doctrine. That was enough. In war, it had to be enough. On a shelf in Moscow, a bent nail waits in its mount. The metal remembers nothing, but the archive remembers everything: the date, the battle, the sergeant who refused to accept that broken equipment meant broken defense. And sometimes, in histories and technical reports and database entries, his name appears: brief, matter-of-fact, insufficient. Sergeant Aleksei Morozov, Battery D7, August 1942. He bent a nail until it worked. A final notation appears in a 1984 Soviet artillery training manual, in a section on equipment maintenance and field readiness. Historical experience demonstrates that technical proficiency and adaptability are equally important. During Defensive Operations 1942, field personnel maintained combat effectiveness despite equipment shortages through innovative application of basic principles. Modern crews must develop similar capability for independent problem-solving under adverse conditions. The text is followed by a footnote referencing Artillery Supplement 742 and listing Morozov Correction Site among examples of effective field modifications. That footnote, brief, technical, bureaucratic, is the closest thing to a monument that Sergeant Morozov received. It sits in a manual that thousands of Soviet and later Russian artillery personnel read during their training. Most skip past it. Some pause, wondering about the story behind that single name and the technique it represents. Very few investigate further, but those who do find the archival trail: Reznov's reports, the casualty lists, the German photograph, the museum gun with its bent wire sight. The pieces are scattered but preserved, waiting to be assembled by anyone curious enough to care about how a man with a nail changed artillery practice across an entire front. That is the echo of August 1942. Not loud, not dramatic, but persistent. It resonates through field manuals and training doctrines, through museum displays and archive databases, through the accumulated lessons that militaries pass from generation to generation. The nail bent, the gun fired, the battery held, and doctrine learned that sometimes the best weapon is a soldier's refusal to give up.